Hello, I'm Hallam-Baker with the Komodo Group, and this is the fourth and final part of my series on making secure email usable. In the first part, I showed the basic technology and the reason why this is an interesting problem to solve. In the second part, I showed the existing solutions and why they fall short, and in the third part, I started laying the foundation for a general solution. In this part, I'm showing the capstone of my proposal, which is a trust infrastructure that's going to allow anybody to know which public key to use to encrypt mail that they're sending to other people on the internet. And this is without doubt the hardest part of solving this email security problem. It's a problem I've been thinking about for 25 years now, and so has the rest of the field. And as I've been looking at it, I've started to think that maybe it's one of those problems that the more you know about the right solution, the harder it is to see the correct one. This is a number sequence problem, and I'll be giving the answer to this later on in the presentation. It's an interesting one because it's a number sequence that has the interesting property that the more you know about mathematical number sequences, the harder it is to solve this puzzle. And the reason for that is that the more used you are to arithmetical and geometrical and so on progressions, the harder it is to spot what is actually going on. I'll show you the answer later on, and I think unless you've seen it before, you're going to be quite upset at what the answer is. But there certainly is an answer. Now, this particular problem was a favourite of a guy called Robert Morris. It's sometimes known as the Cuckoo's egg problem because Richard Stoll used it in the Cuckoo's egg, which is a famous book on internet security, and he never gave the answer. Robert Morris was one of the Unix pioneers who later became the chief scientist for the NSA. And he has a lot of interesting computer security sayings, one of which being, never underestimate the attention, risk, money and time that an opponent will put into reading traffic. Which, if there ever was a statement of NSA intent, it's that one. So the story so far, we can send and receive encrypted email, and it's frictionless. There's no additional effort required to send the messages. But I've only described one trust model, the direct trust model, that allows me to exchange secure email with the people who I've met in person and exchanged keys with in person. Which is a useful facility, it's a useful feature in its own right. However, that only allows me to exchange encrypted email with maybe a few hundred, a few thousand, a few tens of thousands of people at most. The internet has 2 billion people using it, and that's the reason that it's interesting. I can send and receive communications with anybody on the planet, and we've not got a genuine internet email solution until we can exchange secure email with anybody on the planet. And so this is the public key discovery and validation problem, which is the one that I labelled research in part 3. In the testbed prototype, this is what goes in the cloud saying to be determined. Private key management and so on, that's a done deal. Public key discovery and validation is the hard part. And it's hard because we have to rely on somebody else making trust assertions about the people who we want to communicate with. And that puts us at the mercy of other people's decisions, which is never a very comfortable place to be if you're a security person. My approach is based on combining the elements of existing systems. There is the PKIX trust infrastructure that supports SMIME, and also the web PKI. It's what's behind SSL, the infrastructure that allows you to do online commerce. I'm also taking elements of the PGP Web of Trust and a recent proposal called Certificate Transparency that was developed at Google and has since become an IETF working group. To explain what my new system, I have to explain it in context of what went before, and so we'll start off with a brief history of PKI. The first IETF attempt to do secure email was called PEM, Privacy Enhanced Mail. And the reason it never really got off that ground was that it was a very monolithic trust infrastructure. The idea was that there would be this root, and this root authority would issue certificates to second level authorities called policy certification authorities. And these policy certificate authorities would then issue certificates to a subordinate CA, and those CAs would then be issuing certificates for individual universities and companies and all that stuff. It was a very regimental, order of battle, military sort of, chain of command sort of model. And it really didn't fit the internet. The certificate authorities issue certificates. They receive a request for a certificate, they check the request, and if the request is validated, if it meets the criteria, a certificate will be issued. Otherwise it won't. From time to time, a certificate will be issued, and they'll find out afterwards that either the person who requested it wasn't who they say they were, or maybe it's something like a code signing certificate that allows you to sign code for internet applications, and it's been found to be signing malware, in which case we want to take back that certificate, take back the credential, and tell people don't trust it anymore. And this is done by a mechanism called certificates, and another function of the certificate authorities is to publish revocation statements. PEM failed because there was only one root, and everybody in the system was forced to wait for this root to be deployed before they could start building policy certification authorities and the rest. And nobody could ever come to an agreement on how the root should be managed. They couldn't even write down what the requirements were. And the reason this was so hard was that if the root ever defected, they could write a certificate for anything. They could allow anybody to impersonate anybody else. They couldn't write the validation criteria either. Some people were saying, well, those validation criteria are way too strict. We don't need to know government documents. I just want to send email. I know it's Fred. I want to send email to Fred, not who the US government says is Fred. And other people were saying, well, I want to do banking. I want to know that it really is Fred. And so there never was agreement. It was a one-size-fits-all scheme with no choice and no accountability. The root was just going to be a law unto itself, and because of that, nobody could ever come to agreement on what it should do. PGP, in many ways, emerged as a reaction to the failure of PEM. Phil Zimmerman was aware of and part of that discussion group, and he basically walked out because he could see that it wasn't working. And his antithesis was the web of trust. His argument was, well, the web didn't even exist at this point. The internet is a peer-to-peer communication system, and the trust model of the internet should be peer-to-peer as well. Every internet user is situated within a web of trust, and every internet user should sign the keys of the people they know, and those people in turn should sign the keys of the people they know. And if everybody on the internet signs the keys of 10 other people, we will create webs of trust. Eventually these webs of trust will meet, and all the million users of the internet will be able to exchange secure mail. There's a problem with that though, and that is that when PGP was proposed, the internet had 1 million users. Today it has billions. And one of the consequences of that discussion, that difference, is that the length of the trust chains have increased. And trust decreases with the distance. I trust the people who, I trust the key signings that I've done myself to a very high level. Key signings by other people, well, it depends upon who's doing the signing. Some people I trust a great deal. In fact, some people are probably more trustworthy in checking documents and so on than I am. But in general, so trusting somebody else to check those keys, I'm going to trust them on much less. And then the people who they're relying on, much less again. And so the trust decreases very quickly with distance. And by the time we've got chains of 9 or 10 certificates, well, there's hardly any trust there at all. But, the chain should be short, right? Well, this is where the fact that we've got 2 billion people using the internet is such a limitation. Because in mathematics there's a thing called the more bound, which basically says that if you have a graph, that's a graph in mathematical terms consists of nodes connected by arcs, in PGP terms, key holders connected by key signing events. If you have a graph, then the diameter of the graph, which is the length of the longest path through the network, that's the shortest distance between 2 points, the diameter of the graph is going to depend upon the number of nodes in the graph and how many connections, the degree, each node has. And basically, if you have a PGP web of trust with 1 billion nodes and degree 10, it's going to have a diameter of at least 9. And that's just a basic fact of mathematics. The only way in which you can get those path lengths lower is to have a smaller graph. Well, get rid of some people on the planet, that's not going to work. Or have nodes of very high degree, which my argument used to be, well, those nodes of high degree are called certification authorities. But the PGP folk never really accepted that argument. So, in parallel, the PEM people are looking at this and thinking, well, Phil Zimmerman's starting to get something going and we're nowhere. So what are we going to do with this PEM thing? And the PEM working group was kind of collapsing. So what happened was that a group of organisations who wanted to be policy CAs decided, okay, we'll just get rid of the root. We're going to start operating now. We're going to start operating as CAs. And we'll just be our own root authority. So rather than there being one ultimate root, there will be multiple roots. And some of these roots may recognise each other as peers through cross-certification. So essentially this was a synthesis of the PGP and the PEM approaches. But the only people who could do this cross-certification were CAs recognising other CAs. So it wasn't a genuinely democratic peer-to-peer system. A certificate authority has to work within a framework of policy and practices that are quite rigorous. They first of all have to write a certificate policy, which is basically a contract that they have with their relying parties that says what their requirements for issuing certificates are going to be, how they're going to manage their private keys, and lots of good stuff. They also write a certificate practices statement which explains exactly how they are meeting their specified policy. And the practices statement is then used as the basis for a third-party audit. And this will be done by a big name auditing firm like a Dealite, whatever. So in the Web PKI, there are two basic sets of requirements that these policies need to meet. For a basic website authentication, the one that just gets you the padlock and the HTTPS signal, all that is done is to validate the existence and control of the domain. And that's a degree of security that's frequently sufficient. If you only know that domain by its domain name, if you're not going to be putting money at risk at that domain, well, you don't really need to know much more about it than the person behind the website has control of the domain that you're trying to connect to. If, on the other hand, you're looking to buy stuff or do banking at that site, you probably want to know a bit more about the party that you're interacting with and putting money at risk with than that they have paid $10 to buy a DNS name for a year. And so the extended validation requirements are designed to provide additional assurance and validating the existence of the subject behind organisation, behind the certificate, and make sure that the person who is applying for that certificate has the request to do that on behalf of that organisation. And this all provides a degree of accountability. So if you buy stuff from that website and they don't deliver it, and it turns out that it's been a merchant fraud scheme where they've just been taking money from everywhere and then done a runner, at least the police know we've got a place that we can go to and start looking into it. The same sort of assurance that you have when you're doing business with a mail order company. Now, I can show, as a certificate authority, I can show the value that I deliver in the web PKI when I'm authenticating organizations. And I can show a similar type of value when I'm validating an employee of an organization, because if I'm authenticating a bank employee, I will do that through the bank. The bank will have what's called a local registration authority, and they will be responsible for validating the employee. I will validate the bank, and so you'll be able to be confident that this is Fred working for Bank of Ethel. And that works pretty well. But when we get into the field of private individuals, how much value am I really adding right now? And we have 155,000 paid subscribers to SMIME certificates. So there are certainly people who believe that we're adding value now. But I would like to be adding a lot more in this system. And I can't quite see how I can add $10, $50, $100 worth of value in this system to justify my existence if I'm validating government documents. How do I do it for a start? Am I relying on notary publics? Well, what are they going to do when somebody comes in? Am I going to rely on people in booths, in shopping malls, whatever? Am I going to just check to see if they can read the email that's sent to that email address? Only if I'm trying to protect the confidentiality of email, we already know that the NSA can read all those mails. So this is a problem. So let's go back to that problem I showed earlier. It's actually called Conway's problem. And the reason that it's so hard to solve is that it isn't about arithmetic or geometric progressions at all. It's actually called the look-say sequence, and it's of interest in image compression. And the sequence goes, so we start off with 1, and the next number and so we have 1, 1. The next number in the sequence is 2 1s. The next number in that I have 1, 2, and 1, 1. The look-say sequence is simply looking at the previous sequence and reading it out. So the next number in the sequence is 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1. 3 1s, 2 2s, 1 1. So the next number is 3 1, 2 2, 1 1. And so on. So now we have 1 3, 1 1, 2 2s, 2 1s. And there's actually math that you can do, and you can show that this sequence actually expands forever, and you can show the number of 1s and 3s and so on, and there's never a number higher than 4 and so on. The point about Conway's problem is that if you come to the problem with the wrong frame of mind, it's impossible to solve. You have to be able to get into the right mindset, and then once you're in the right mindset, the solution just falls out. And I believe that the right mindset for solving the trust infrastructure problem is Shannon's work factor. And this came to me after a particularly disastrous presentation that I gave where Whip Diffie turned up, and I hadn't been told he would be turning up, and he kind of made mincemeat of it. And so the work factor is really what is behind That's what quantifies the difficulty of breaking cryptographic ciphers. If we have a symmetric cipher with a 16-bit key, there are 2 to the 16 different possible keys, so 65,536 different possible keys. The brute force work factor is 2 to the power 16. DES has 56-bit keys, so the brute force work factor is 2 to the power 56, which is 72,000 trillion, which sounded like an awfully high number in the 1970s when DES was first proposed. Turned out to be a rather smaller number by the 2000s when DES was broken in a few hours using a specially designed machine at the RSA conference. AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, has work factors of 2 to the power 128, 2 to the power 192, and 2 to the power 256. So the weakest variant of AES is 4.7 billion trillion times stronger than DES, which is quite a large increase in difficulty. So what's the difficulty of attacking our existing trust model? Well, the PKIX validation model, if I'm looking at an organization, the way that I've always worked out is I've looked at the cost of setting up bogus organizations, getting the articles of incorporation signed off and all that stuff, and I can show that it costs $2,000, $3,000 odd to fake my systems. And then you have to look at not just the cost of doing that, but the return on the investment that a criminal might have, how repeatable it is, and so on and so forth. So the PKIX validation model for individuals, though, if I'm basing my authentication on government identity papers, well, forging government identity papers isn't actually that expensive. You know, we're talking between $50 and a few $1,000s to obtain fake identity papers. The PGP Web of Trust, well, here it's interesting because if I'm talking about my direct trust connections, then the cost of forgery is essentially, hundreds of thousands of dollars. In order to perpetrate a forgery on me as a relying party, the cost is essentially is prohibitive. They would have to impersonate themselves to me. But that cost decreases with each hop away from me. And if we're talking about keys that I happen to find on some PGP key server somewhere, I don't know whether that key is a genuine key or if it's been generated by the same sort of processes that people use called link farming to generate bogus entries in search engines. The same type of approach can be used to generate a completely bogus web of trust of millions of keys, all sign each other, upload them to multiple servers, and it's simply nonsense signing nonsense all the way down. So the problem with the PGP Web of Trust is that the work factor depends upon who is evaluating the Web of Trust. And that means that it's essentially impossible for me to use that in a commercial sense because I'm not selling an objective product. And this is where certificate transparency comes in. Certificate transparency began as a project at Google, led by Ben Laurie with Adam Langley and Amelia Casper. And the problem we were trying to solve here was to make the web PKI stronger by requiring certificate issue be a public event. And this would then allow Google to monitor the issue of all certificates on the web for CAs issuing bogus certificates for google.com and also for other other domains. And this would allow them to spot CAs that have gone rotten more quickly and easily than they could before. And it also means that any other relying party can check to see if a certificate was wrongfully issued for their domain and then published. Certificate transparency is a very important contribution to the field. But what might be even more important is the notion of transparency itself. in that we've always had the notion of auditability and the idea that this system can be checked by some trusted third party. With transparency, we've gone a stage further, and we have a system where anybody can audit the system using information that is public knowledge, and that's all they need to audit the system. Incidentally, this is also one of the reasons why Bitcoin is so interesting from a technical point of view, although Ben Laurie and myself are both kind of the main Bitcoin skeptics going in the field. The way that CT works is that they have a timestamp notary, and that observes that the certificate data has been published in some log and creates a notarization of that event, and that is notarization is stored in a append-only log, and then the proof of the notarization can be embedded in the certificate itself, and then anybody relying on the certificate can check to see whether it was published. In particular, CT is making use of a technical infrastructure called catenate certificates, or hash chains. The notary includes the output of the last block into the input of the next block of documents that they're going to notarize. And what that means is that when you have a chain of these notarization blocks, it's not possible to modify any link in the chain without causing all the blocks that are downstream of the change block to also change. And so if you publish the notary sequence at regular intervals, for example in a newspaper, it's not possible to change the notary sequence without invalidating all those published notary values. And so this means that the catenate certificate work factor is a product of time. The cost of inserting an element into the notary chain at the current time is zero. All we need to do is to include it into the input of the next hash block. But the cost of going backwards in time to change a previously published and fixed notary output is essentially infinite. The only way that it can be done is to break the cryptography. Otherwise, you'd have to collect up all the newspapers in which the chain had been published and change all the newspapers. So I'd like to add certificate transparency-like features to email, which leaves me in a little bit of a quandary, because the question is, should I use Google's code or develop a parallel system? And for the time being, I'm working in parallel. The reason for this is I used to share an office with Jim Gettis, who's one of the guys behind the X Windows system, and he always drilled into me the risks of what Xerox PARC called Error 22. Don't build research on research, because if you do that, you're not just putting your own research at risk, you may be prematurely dooming that other researcher to failure, because your requirements are going to bias his research path at a time when it's not productive to do so. So we're going to develop these two things in parallel at this point, even though I intend to be active in the certificate transparency work, and we'll look on convergence at a later date. So what happens when you start timestamping PKIX and PGP certificates? Well, PKIX certificates are already timestamped, but they're only timestamped at the time of issue of the certificate, and there's no long-term, keys are not permanent long-term. When the certificate expires, in general, the key also expires. If we start timestamping key fingerprints, like I explained in the part 3, a fingerprint is designed to last 10, 20, 30 years. It's designed to potentially last the lifetime of the key holder. If we timestamp fingerprints, we get the key continuity over decades, and we have a work factor that we can notarize at particular points in time and leverage over date. PGP has a similar problem. The PGP protocol can be used to create a timestamp, but it doesn't integrate into a timestamping infrastructure. If we join a timestamp notary infrastructure to PGP or PKIX, we can build a stronger system. My proposal is that we have 3 types of signed assertion. We'll have the prism hardening block, the PHB I described in the last presentation, which is a signed policy assertion that is signed under a key that has a particular fingerprint. We will have CA issued certificates in the PKIX X509 model to support trusted third-party models, and we'll have key endorsements, which are peer-to-peer movements that can be made by anybody who has a fingerprint. So these could be people who have CA issued certificates or simply ordinary keys that aren't endorsed by anybody else. And all of these signed assertions are going to be notarized at issue or as soon as possible after issue, which fix the work factor in time. Why is that important? Well, let's consider the difficulty of impersonating the President of the United States. Now, if you went back to the date of the inauguration and created a bogus certificate endorsement for Barack Obama, well, you know at that point he's going to be president, and so any attacker who would know that if I had a key for Barack Obama that somebody else is going to trust, well, that's obviously going to be very valuable. So a key endorsement for Barack Obama by itself on January the 20th, 2009 is not really worth anything at all, unless it's supported and corroborated by some other information. If it was signed by the outgoing president and we could trust that key, then it would matter a great deal, but by itself it's not worth anything. If, on the other hand, public key cryptography had been invented rather earlier and this infrastructure had been available at the time that Barack Obama was a student at Harvard Law School, and as part of the enrollment ceremony they had endorsed each other's public keys, then that particular endorsement would be worth a very great deal indeed, because an attacker could not have known at the date that the students are starting at Harvard Law School that one of them, let alone a particular student, was going to eventually become President of the United States. And of course, the further back in time we go, the stronger the assertion becomes. If his parents had generated a public key for him at the time of his birth, and that had been notarized or printed in the Hawaiian newspapers at the time of his birth, that would have been an exceptionally strong demonstration that it was his public key. And so notarizing these events back in time increases the work factor, because it's not just that the cost of impersonation would be $1,000. That $1,000 has to be spent before a particular moment in time. After that moment in time, the work factor becomes infinite, effectively. And that's the wonderful thing about the time-based work factor. It is always going to increase monotonically. At the time of issue, an assertion may be worth nothing. But the longer that assertion is around and maturing, the earlier an attacker would have had to have anticipated the need and the incentive to impersonate it. And so if you have an assertion that's been around for 10, 20 years, just the fact that it's been around for that length of time makes for a large work factor, even if there's no other reason to trust it. So what's the work factor of insertion? If we look at PKIX and PGP alone, the work factor is very low. If we have 1,000 PKIX certificates and the work factor for any one certificate is the cost of forging a government document, that might be as low as $50. If you have 10,000 PGP key signings, well, the work factor could be 0, because I can generate 10,000 PGP key signings on this machine here without needing to involve anybody else. It's probably about 50 cents worth of electricity, if that. But what happens if we combine the two? Well, that's where we start to win big, because we have 1,000 certificates and the individual work factor is 50. But if you multiply 50 by 1,000, we've got to 50,000. That's quite a large work factor, particularly if it had to be spent at a particular point in time. And it's not just that we can lock down those PKIC certificates, we can lock down the PGP key signed certificates as well. So how does this work? Well, imagine that we have a composite PKI that has CA issued events, those are the red ones, and peer-to-peer signings that aren't otherwise endorsed. They're not being endorsed in a structured way. So in this graph, it's the same PGP graph that I used earlier. We've got 3 CA issued events and 4 endorsement events. 4 nodes that are only supported by peer endorsements. And imagine the cost of the CA, of getting the better of the CA, is $50, and that an endorsement from one of those links is worth half as much. So if we start from one node in this graph, we can now calculate the cost or the work factor for the nodes for which it's collected. So we've got a $25 net, 2 $25 nodes here, and one node that's $100. And then we can go to the next stages. The point here is that we've taken what was a subjective work factor that depended upon the starting point in the PGP graph and a low work factor in the PKIC graph, and by merging the two, we've ended up with a work factor that is objective and increases with the endorsements. And it increases over time. And that is what makes the composite PKI stronger than the individual PKIs of which it's composed. So the composite PKI is stronger than the 2 PKIs from which it's composed. But there may be some other problems. For example, is it economically viable? Is there a free rider problem in which nobody's going to bother to get a CA issued assertion because the peer-to-peer endorsements are almost as good, and so there won't be any CA endorsements? Well, I hope not, because I work for Komodo, which is a certification authority, and I think that Melly wants to get some return on this work potentially. I think that's actually rather unlikely for a number of reasons. But even if it turned out that there was no market for individual certification authority statements because the peer-to-peer endorsements were just as good, there would still be a much larger market in the enterprise for email security infrastructures. And because those enterprises would be wanting to say not just this person is Alice, but this person is Alice who works for us, which is of course, if that message is coming through your bank, the much more important statement, that infrastructure would still need to be in the PKICS model, and so there will be a much larger market for that infrastructure. The other thing that we can look at is, well, what else can we do to increase this time-based work factors? And one of the things that we can do maybe is to build on an old practice in PGP, which is key signing parties. People keep telling me not to call them key parties, which I'm told is something else. Not sure what, but in a key signing party, in the traditional model, everybody who wants to sign keys with everybody else they'll go around the room and everybody will sign everybody else's keys. So if you have 20 people taking part, everybody will endorse everybody else's key, which is useful and allows an expansion in the direct trust model. But maybe we could go a bit further. Maybe if we made key signing a feature at industry conventions or whatever, then everybody who is present at that convention could get their key endorsed in such a way that you would know that not only were they endorsed, but they were endorsed at this particular convention. Why is that important? Well, if the convention has a fee of $1,000, $2,000 plus the travel time, that is in itself quite a sizable work factor that an attacker trying to impersonate me would have to overcome. And if we have something like the RSA conference, which I've been going to now for 15 years, and I had my key endorsed at every one of the conferences I attended, that would be in aggregate now close to $30,000 worth of conference fees that somebody would have had to have paid going back 15 years in the past to have the pleasure of impersonating me today. So this is an opportunity for outreach in that, obviously the key signing parties are going to get people to use strong email, but it's also a way of binding the web of trust further and increasing that work factor. That's why the work factor is so important, because now we have a way of quantifying how a particular proposal increases the difficulty of attack. To implement this scheme, we've got basically two things that we need to do. First of all, you have a mechanism for doing these peer endorsements, and this is fairly simple. We've already got the code in PGP. We just need to take it across and make it into mobile apps, make it into something that people can use conveniently when they're on the road. The second thing we need to do is to develop this timestamp notary infrastructure, which so far I haven't really got started on, but I know that it's a soluble problem. You see, the thing is, when I was talking about the notary, I assumed that the notary can't be subordinated because of the blockchain being fixed in time. The reason that I'm so confident that that's possible is that one notary can accept as input the output from other notaries. So if you have a collection of 20 notaries, we can very soon arrive at a situation where it is impossible for one notary to defect and insert bogus blocks into the chain unless every other notary defects with them. And so if you had an infrastructure where these notaries are being run by the US, Iran, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, Brazil, we can very soon make it almost inconceivable that all those parties are going to collude to force a fraudulent blockchain on us. And we can take other mechanisms that make it impossible for that to succeed as well. So in conclusion, frictionless email security is possible. We've got a proof of concept, it's practical and it's deployable. We have open source code on SourceForge. We have a prototype that implements the plumbing, and the next step will be to implement the bit I described in this presentation, which is the trust infrastructure. If you're interested in writing crypto code, we really need to have more people extending this infrastructure. Competing trust models can build upon the plumbing that I built to implement mine. There's no sense in everybody developing their own mail message formats, key formats and all that work. That's all work that differences don't add value, so let's just build on what exists, or at least agree on one thing to build upon and work from there. So what are the next steps? Well, I think that everybody should get to use strong email encryption. And I think that being able to live in a society where you're not always being watched by the military is a fundamental human right. I certainly don't believe that the military have any business doing law enforcement. I grew up in Europe where we had rather too many militaries on the street corners holding carbines to intimidate people. But the people who provide email clients are only going to respond if they believe that there's a demand for for email security. So we need the Microsofts, the Googles, the Apples, the Mozillas to take notice. And they're not going to take notice of me. They're going to take notice of email users. So we need email users to be telling them, we want email that is secure. We need coders, in that I've written code, but I'm a security guy. I might just be having you on. How do you know that my code is correct? Open source code isn't any more secure than proprietary. Only reviewed code is more secure than proprietary. So don't trust my code because it's open source. Only trust it if you think that some people are actually reviewing it. And we need more researchers, in that I've developed a trust model to meet the trust infrastructure needs as I see them, but I'm pretty sure I don't have all those needs. So we need more people looking at the problem and providing more solutions. So that's the end of my email security, my email encryption security podcast. If people like these podcasts, I can keep doing more. One obvious next topic would be to look at email authentication. We've done encryption, making sure the mail is confidential. Well, how do you know that mail message came from your bank? Wouldn't that be a good thing to add to the email system? And I've had some ideas from that. They're actually in my book, The .Crime Manifesto. There's a thing I call the confirmation protocol. This provides a thing called two-factor authentication, so that if you're logging into your website, you could use your phone to log into a website and prove that you're not just the person who knows the password, you know the password is carrying your phone. And there are some systems out there already. This is a system that I worked on at a previous employer, where you have a little number, and that number changes every 30 seconds, and you then have to type the number in to access the website, which is really not a very interesting way of authenticating myself, because what I really want is for a message to come up on the phone and say, do you really want to log into this website, yes or no? And I hit yes or no, and then it's done. Why should I be typing in stupid numbers? And then, the other thing we could do is to flip the problem around and look at data level security and ask, well, what could the NSA have done to stop themselves being rolled by Edward Snowden in the first place? I mean, here we have a 29-year-old, his girlfriend's a stripper, and he manages to not only get a trusted job at the NSA, he managed to walk out the doors with 1 million highly classified, ultra top secret documents, and nobody stopped it. And the fact is, the NSA could have done tons to stop him. Now, should we help the NSA do that? Well, I'm not sure yes or no, but I know that I want to stop the Edward Snowdens who might be taking my private information and maybe selling it or using it for purposes that are a lot less acceptable. So thank you for listening. Thank you for staying through this podcast. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you'd like me to make further ones. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you.